In this lesson, we'll see how we can utilize the mental ray basic photonic materials. So this is a node that becomes very, very important to use if you're going to be using some kind of a mental ray base shader, like the mental ray base Lambert, Blinn, or Phong materials, together with some kind of a photonic interaction, something like global illumination or caustics. You'll notice that once we apply these materials, set up our light, and set this light to emit some kind of photons, that whenever we hit render, we'll actually be presented with an error that states that no photons have been stored. Now the reason is that by default these mental ray base materials do not have the ability to interact with photons in any way. So whenever using photons, we need to make certain that we connect a few additional nodes. So let's start with something like the floor, this illumination Lambert shader. So let's take a look inside the hypershade. And to connect this, all we have to do is take a look inside the node itself, take a look at the input and output connections to expose the shading group, and we'll go over to the photonic materials, and in this case we'll use just the MIB Photon Basic. So we can plug this in, and you notice that this has some attributes as far as the color of the photons that are going to be emitted once they bounce off of this particular material. We can also control how shiny this material is in respect to photons and how transparent it is. So in our case, let's just take the shading group, expand the mental ray tab, scroll down, and we'll take this photon shader, middle click, and make sure we drop it into the photon shader port. Now we can have some kind of photon interactions on this blue material. Now let's do the same thing on our walls, because what will happen now is we actually will be able to get some kind of photon interactions on the floor as far as them being able to bounce up, but because none of our other objects have the ability to interact with photons, they'll bounce off the floor and then just keep on going. So we really won't see any kind of an effect of photons just yet. So let's go to this gray base material, and we'll do the exact same thing. We'll take a photon basic material, connect it into the photon shader port, and there we go. So now let's just very quickly hit render and see what we get. So now we can definitely see that the photon interactions are happening, but one of the things that we can actually see is though that the effect is overall much, much brighter than what it should be. So what we can always do is go back to any of these photonic materials and begin to adjust those, because you'll notice that in this result we actually don't have any sort of blue light that should be bouncing up off of this floor and casting a little bit of blue tint onto the walls and this sphere. The reason is because this photonic material that's connected into this blue surface shader is set to gray, which means that the photons that bounce off of this material will be gray. So all we would have to do is go back to the diffuse, and we can start to shade this the color that we want. So if we wanted something a little bit more on the blue side, we can do that. And then we can also start to lower this specular, so that way the photons don't have quite as much energy as they bounce off. It'll try to treat this as more of a diffuse surface instead of something that's very, very shiny, which is partially responsible for this very bright effect that we have. So now, what we should start to get whenever we render is a lot more of this blue material, or this blue shading, which we didn't have before. So similar to what we just had to do on the floor, we'll probably need to adjust the photon shader on the walls, because right now you can see that this is still very, very bright. So let's go back to this base shader, take a look inside the photon shading port, and we can start to bring down this specular again, so that way the photons won't treat this as such a shiny surface. And we can also probably start to lower this diffuse a little bit more as well, so we can darken up the overall effect of these walls. And there we go. Now you can see we have a much more subdued result, much more controllable. Again, because now the photons that are bouncing off of this surface have a much lower intensity. So that's a look at how we can utilize this mental ray photonic materials as a way of getting correct global illumination interactions with our objects.